in order to do that, that's why I firmly believe that implementing teaching methods and curriculum that cultivate a broader, more poetic spirit or perspective will help us to grow as individuals and as a society. So I'm going to go through and, point out about this, the poetic spirit of perspective. What is that? And, kind of delve into ignorance and, other characteristics. And at the end, I'm going to share some actions that, we can take based on the strategies I'm going to mention. So, first, if we, think of the idea of a poetic spirit or perspective, and what does that have to do with defeating ignorance, right? So I know a lot of times, and I know even for me, even before I got into, poetry and whatnot, I thought, it has this association of being for some people like kind of very silly and impractical or kind of like a frivolous endeavor, and which I get because I've thought that before too, but poetic perspective or cultivating it and cultivating a poetic spirit is more than poems, and it's not necessarily just about poetry, and it's definitely not, its aim is not to try to make everybody into a poet. It's for regular people, for everyday life. And it's strictly, it can be a practical tool in addition to being fun, for those who enjoy it. And, the way that I see poetic perspective is almost like when, for those who've seen the movie The Matrix, you're familiar with the scene kind of towards the end. Sorry, this is a spoiler for those who haven't seen it. But the protagonist, Neo, there is a pivotal scene in which he is able to finally see underneath reality or the matrix, and where he can see there's underlying pattern and code underneath everything that's holding it all together. And when he's able to see from a different perspective, in that moment, then he is able to fight evil on a whole other level. And there is a quote from Buddhist philosopher and educator, Daisaku Ikeda, that speaks more to this poetic spirit. And so from the book Hope and Joy in Education, it says Ikeda has long advocated the need to revive the poetic spirit in modern society, viewing as a fundamental perception of the eternal, subtle rhythm that permeates the self, the world, and the entire universe. And, we know that in research also, it shows that there are many benefits in engaging in poetry, including helping people to challenge their own perspectives, becoming more tolerant of other, viewpoints, and they're then able to appreciate the nuances of other people's opinions. And picking up on nuance is such an important skill because without being able to pick up on nuance, it's easier to take advantage of people. And so, I've seen that also, within my teaching with students who are able to develop their ability to pick up on nuance and, in the form of them beginning to challenge misinformation because they were able to then detect inconsistencies and identify the truth. And this has also helped them become more aware as consumers, as employees, and in their interactions with other people. And if we know, that life operates on multiple levels, um, I wanted to show this image that illustrates that. Sorry, one moment. Yeah, of this iceberg, right? And so a poetic perspective would mean, the ability to see both what's above the surface, as this melty, maybe, this is like a case for climate change or something. I don't know. But anyway, but it's this above surface, literal level of reality or what's shown, and simultaneously look beneath at the subtext of reality. And so again, a poetic perspective is the ability to see both above the surface and below the surface at the same time. And so I'm going to be breaking down, like I said, why poetic language specifically makes it a tool for defeating ignorance. And though I just do want to point out that, so I'm not saying that engaging with poetic language is going to automatically make everybody into these enlightened beings where they're just like, having this great insight and sound reasoning all the time. But, so that's not the case. But what engagement with poetic language that is focused with the aim of expanding the poetic or broader spirit, that kind of engagement with poetic language does increase the likelihood of a person developing a more broad sense of self and increasing their skills at connecting dots. So let's look at ignorance, from both a surface level, that literal surface level, and then from a deeper poetic perspective. So if we look first at the dictionary definition of what is ignorance, I'm going to show you. Ignorance is the state or fact of being ignorant, a lack of knowledge, education, or awareness. And so then the question for us to consider would be, okay, a lack of awareness or a lack of knowledge of what, right? And so if we look at the surface level, this literal dictionary definition of ignorance, we could insert almost anything into the what part, right? So for example, maybe we have a lack of knowledge of how to cook a certain meal, or, we don't know how to unclog our toilet, or we don't know, a person has a lack of awareness of what to do when a raccoon runs into their house, right? And so when we're looking at the idea of ignorance from that angle of these specific types of knowledge or awareness, we don't really associate it so much in a negative way, right? It seems a little more harmless, more innocent, because at the end of the day, nobody knows everything, right? There's something that we're all, ignorant of. But then when we go a little deeper into exploring ignorance, we have what we call willful ignorance, right? And so that kind of ignorance we do associate with kind of a more like, I don't know if it has a malicious intent, but there is a more malicious type of flavor to that type of ignorance, because we know it is a more conscious one where they're aware and they're intentionally, right, choosing to be ignorant. And this was demonstrated in a study conducted with thousands of participants, and which the American Psychological Association published a research article on. So I want to show you the findings that said, when given the choice to learn how their actions would affect someone else, 40% of people will choose ignorance, often in order to have an excuse to act selfishly. And the report goes on, while most people are willing to do the right thing when they are fully informed of the consequences of their actions, this willingness is not always because people care for others. A part of the reason why people act altruistically is due to societal pressures as well as their desire to view themselves in a good light. And since being righteous is often costly, demanding people to give up their time, money, and effort, ignorance offers an easy way out. So I wanted to highlight that phrase, that part of it where it says ignorance offers an easy way out, because it's so true, right? So how ignorance is actually easier than the path of awareness or enlightenment, or seeking a higher sense of what's going on. And so we can see it clearly displayed in the learning process, right? And so it's always easier, I feel like, when we're looking at other people and analyzing them, than when, it's harder to look at ourselves and how we're thinking. And so if we kind of take it outside of ourselves and see, okay, for example, in like a classroom setting, right? If there's a student, whenever there's a student who's learning something and they are struggling to understand a new concept or a skill or information, there is a moment in their learning process where they or we have to make a decision, right? When they begin to feel that discomfort um, in learning something new or difficult, it requires them to make the decision to push past that resistance, right? That they experience of their prior limited knowledge or skill or way of thinking. And so, in order to dispel ignorance, it requires the student to learn, the student has to push forward, right? When they meet that resistance. Um, because the discomfort we're experiencing when we hit that wall is just us feeling the wall of our previous limitations. And so that process reminds me of the way that lobsters grow, which, I learned from a friend of mine a few years back. And that image has really stuck with me because I feel like it's so clear to our process of growth as well. Obviously, not we're not like literally shedding out of our skeletons, but in terms of learning, it's similar. So for those who aren't familiar, that the process of lobsters growing is that they have obviously their shell or the exoskeleton, and then when it's time for them to grow into a new bigger self or shell, they have to shed the old one. But it's that in between process that leaves them super vulnerable, right? So they have to go like hide under a rock or, get some kind of shelter, because they're vulnerable or insecure, we could say, and so if we liken it to ourselves and in the learning process and dispelling our own ignorance and gaining more understanding, then, there's always that part of the process where we begin to feel uncomfortable or even like pain and on some level, I guess, but if we are to retreat, right, from experiencing that wall and that discomfort that comes with the process of breaking through that wall, then we'll just stay in our smaller version of ourselves, right, in that limited self, and we will never be able to expand that broader more expansive version of ourselves. So similarly, I feel that this applies not only for lobsters and us as individuals in our learning process, but I feel like this also applies to us as a society, right, where we um, you know, every once in a while or maybe frequently, we come up against what seems like a wall or this like limit of remaining in our smaller self. And, so it takes this collective concerted effort to break through so that we can experience that more expansive version of ourself. And, so going back to the levels of ignorance, so that, we talked about the literal surface level, the dictionary definition version of the ignorance that's, it's harmless because we all have something we're ignorant of, right? We don't know specific kinds of information or knowledge sometimes. And then there is the willful ignorance, right? Where we associate with, you know, um, being more negative, again, because it is conscious or it's a choice to be ignorant. But then the deepest and trickiest level of ignorance that, based on this comparison is fundamental or deep rooted ignorance. So I want to show you an image of what I'm talking about. So this is a, a hand drawing I made, very basic, but it makes the point, literally, right? So, talk about the layers of ignorance. So we have the innocent ignorance or the literal surface level of ignorance, then we have willful ignorance, and then we have the fundamental deep-rooted ignorance, which is covering up the truth, which is at the center. And so this deep-rooted ignorance, the reason why fundamental ignorance is so tricky is because it's hard to identify. Um, because the people who are experiencing that aren't even aware that they're coming from a place of fundamental ignorance. And it distorts the ways of thinking itself. So it can't be eradicated just by presenting that person with information because their way of thinking itself is distorted or diluted, right? And so, um, to give a metaphor again, it would be like a broken or a tarnished mirror, right? And so if you put an object in front of a broken or tarnished mirror, it's not going to be reflected as what's actually there, right? It's always going to appear broken or tarnished. And so similarly, no matter what information you put in front of a person coming from fundamental ignorance, it's going to be seen through the lens of, kind of a distorted version of that. And there is a quote from this article: our belief makes us stronger, more resilient, that, delves deeper into defining what fundamental ignorance is. And so it says, we can describe fundamental ignorance in many ways. In brief, it is disbelief in our Buddha nature and the supreme dignity of all life. This root of suffering often manifests as greed, anger, and foolishness, leading to things like discrimination, antagonism, and even war. And so, with this, in essence, fundamental or deep-rooted ignorance is always, basically, it's always operating to cover up the truth. And that's similar to, like how clouds are covering up the sun, right? And so then if we are then to look at then what is truth, right? That's something we have to be able to recognize, because if we are to defeat ignorance, we have to recognize, okay, what is it doing? Covering of the truth. Okay, so then what is the truth? So if we look at truth from a surface level and then a deeper poetic level, we can, take a stab at it, right? Because I know seeking what is the truth and to define it is, sort of almost like an existential question, that I guess, many people feel like there is no answer to, but, we can always attempt. And so if we look at the surface level definition of truth, it is real things, events, and facts, right? Very straightforward. And so within that context, we know that truth and facts have some similarities, but they're not always the same, right? And so I want to show some images that relate to that, right? So we have here these two gentlemen, where one whose song, you know, mentioned the word facts a lot, which I thought was really interesting because that sort of embodies that, kind of literal surface layer of examining things. And, the second is the example of truth, right? And in their last song, in the battle too, it actually he mentions truth a lot. Yeah, so I just thought it was actually kind of like a perfect example of like facts are like what's on the surface and truth is like what's under the surface. And this is illustrated further by this quote by Daisaku Ikeda, where he says, "There's a difference between mere facts and the truth, though this may be difficult to comprehend. The facts as people perceive them do not necessarily represent the truth. For example, suppose there is a man who gives a great deal of money to the poor. His charitable act is an irrefutable fact, and from this, some might conclude that he is a kind-hearted and generous individual. Yet, this may not necessarily be true. His actions may have been calculated with the expectation of receiving some sort of future gain or advantage, or he may have done it to ingratiate himself with someone. In other words, facts don't always reveal the truth. If we allow our eyes to focus exclusively on the facts, we may end up losing sight of the truth entirely." And, so if we look then at the deeper poetic level of what is truth, um, we can see that underlying truth is often seen as a universal force that binds all phenomena, right? And so, some people would, define or see that universal force and call it God, right? And others may, see it completely just as an objective scientific law. It's not religious, and then where there may be others who may define the universal force as, kind of an in between of those two, or maybe a combination of those two, where it's like a universal spiritual law, but it doesn't have a specific name or image to it, right? So, but in any case, the common idea of universal truth is that it is a binding element, right? So, regardless of our belief system, you know, that's what it can commonly be interpreted as, and that it's something that exists both inside of us and outside of us. And, so we can recognize that, we are, all bound by, the pulse of life in a sense, right? So both in the physical form in our flesh, with our heartbeat, or, when we are, examining, on, the level of like molecules and atoms that are constantly vibrating, or the fact that our planet or the planets are, rotating at a certain rate on their axis, right? So all of those are different types of rhythm that govern not only life, but all phenomena, right, in the universe. And so we can say, based on that knowledge, that regardless of, our individual belief system, whether, you're religious or you're atheist, what we can't deny is that there is a universal rhythm of life. And there's a set of patterns that dictate our very existence, right? And so, universal pattern and rhythm are expressed in different ways, one of which is through poetic language, which is why, it's mimicked within it, and because it's mimicking the universal pattern and rhythm of life. And this is why from ancient times, from indigenous oral traditions to, the major world religions, whether Hinduism, Buddhism, Christianity, Islam, and, all of them, right? They are all centered on poetic storytelling. They all utilize poetic language in order to convey a spiritual message, right? So it's not a coincidence that that is the central method by which the great sages or messengers and, teachers have taught, because they're all onto something. And so I have personally been curious as to what is it specifically about poetic language that, was the choice of them to do this, right? Like, what is it specifically about poetic language that makes it conducive to, communicate enlightenment and in defeating, ignorance, right? Or our lesser self. And so, kind of in my curiosity and in my studies of this topic, I've identified four key characteristics that I notice is across the board with that. And so the first one that I've noticed, the characteristic that makes poetic language conducive to defeating ignorance and bringing forth enlightenment is in its rhythm and flow. Um, and so, you know, I'll ask you, so, can you think of the first time you ever heard rhythm? And okay, I'll give you a second, but all right, so we should all actually have the same answer because it was our mother, right? So all of us first heard rhythm inside the womb, right? And although we probably don't remember that, and if we did, that, I would be scared, but maybe, I don't know, maybe some people remember that, but I don't think so. But regardless, we can assume that, since we, develop hearing in there and, that is the dominant sound that we hear, that is a part of our sort of foundational memory, right? In a sense, in this lifetime, anyway. And so, if we look at then, how interestingly connected to that is within religions, most religions are seeking the origin of life, right? Or to expound upon it, right? And they're also seeking to then create methods of connecting to the source, right, of life. And, while we may have different, views in terms of the intangible aspect of that source, what we can all agree on, I think, or at least most of us, is that, biologically, at least, right, we can agree on that part, that life begins with the rhythm and the flow that we experience in the womb. And so accordingly, poetic language and rap freestyling captures these natural rhythms and the flow that expresses the origin of life from where we began biologically. And um, yeah, so we see that expressed in different ways. The second characteristic that makes poetic language conducive to defeating ignorance and bringing forth enlightenment is its use of metaphor and simile. And so we know that metaphors and similes are specific methods of comparison that lead us from one understanding or perception and into another, right? And they form connections or bridges between seemingly disparate or, seemingly unrelated ideas and objects. And so by doing that, metaphors and similes help to highlight interconnectedness. And so this is why sages and religious messengers used metaphors and similes in their poetic teaching. It was in order to lead people from one understanding of themselves into another kind of understanding of themselves, because that requires forming bridges of thought. And so, for example, Siddhartha Gautama, aka Shakyamuni, aka Buddha, as he's historically known, although, technically we all have that potential within us, it's not just that one guy. Um, but anyway, so Shakyamuni, he was a poetic teacher who employed the extensive use of similes and metaphors. And in the Lotus Sutra, which is regarded by many as his most comprehensive or, highest teaching, just based on the content and the messaging that's within it of this, absolute equality of all life and the infinite potential within it. And so, but unique to the Lotus Sutra, in comparison to Shakyamuni's previous teachings, was its prominent use of verse, which all focus on using parables and extended metaphors to lead his students and audience into a greater understanding of themselves and the world. And so the third characteristic that makes poetic language a tool for defeating ignorance is its use of subtext, right? Subtext into consciousness. And what I mean by that is that, you know, when we only focus on and accept the surface literal meaning of words, we're also limited in perceiving the interconnectedness of life. Uh, and those who aren't able to detect subtext are easier to take advantage of by those who benefit from encouraging ignorance in the masses. And higher order thinking requires the formation of meaningful connections beyond what is immediately obvious. So, this process of analyzing subtext helps us to pay closer attention, which has practical application in our daily life. And the fourth characteristic of why poetic language is a practical tool in defeating ignorance and bringing forth enlightenment is how it embodies the battle of good and evil. So, if we're to look at how actually oppression, as we know, is battled both internally and externally, right? And so this was the same battle that the great sages and the religious messengers also experienced, right? Is this internal battle. And because of that, none of them were really, they weren't necessarily trying to create a religion per se, but they were trying to emancipate themselves, right, from that battle, or they're basically trying to win over the battle of their lesser self. So in that, they're trying to basically overcome their internal suffering, right? And then by proxy or then by effect also want to emancipate others from suffering as well. And so in order to do this, they used poetic language to express themselves and their message of winning over this internal battle of, the good and evil inside of themselves. And, it is through that battle over the lesser self, internally, through accessing the greater self internally, this enabled them to achieve a broader sense of life and oneness with the universe. And in their reach to become one with the universe, we reveal that we are actually the universe itself, and that one verse binds this all together. And this one verse, binding all together, is expressed in the form of a chant. And while there's, many different faiths and spiritual practices that utilize different chants, I personally find the chant Namyo Horenge Kyo, as propagated by the SGI community, to be the most effective and efficient chant, based on its composition, its meaning, and its intention. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about chanting at the end of the video, and I will make sure to include a link in the description box for anyone who wants to find out more about the practice. And so, so even though we have these tools of poetic language, it's important to note that it's most effective within community. Right. And so, because kind of left on our own, it's kind of easy to get, stuck in the mire of our own, thoughts, right? Where we may not even be aware that we are coming from that place, or that we are experiencing this, a moment of that fundamental ignorance, or maybe it's many moments that we're experiencing it. And, so the value of community, in defeating ignorance and bringing forth enlightenment, is explained here. And this is from the March 2020 Living Buddhism by Daisaku Ikeda, where he says, even if they were given theoretical explanations of the mystic law or told to practice to overcome sufferings, the life state of Buddhahood could not be conveyed to them through such words alone, Rather, it was through being inspired by coming into contact with the Buddha's character, along with the words of instruction, that they awakened to the mystic law within their lives. This is how the mystic law was communicated to them. So this is saying that, combating ignorance isn't just about the tools and the information, although both are crucial to have. But that it's also about our character as a human being and the character of those we associate with and follow. And so this highlights the value of staying connected to a community that's focused on enlightenment and uplifting the human condition. And so in closing, I just wanted to share a few types of action based on the, poetic language engagement strategies that I mentioned. And so the first suggestion is to support the teaching of poetic language in your local communities, especially for youth. And so this might look like, just doing some research to find out what, local organizations in your area are doing, the real work in their communities and have a record of achievement or effectiveness in, serving the objectives. And, you could support them by contributing your time or, your money, or maybe you have access to resources, right? And then, so a second suggestion that I have in terms of action is to support poetic language operating on a larger scale. So by this, I mean, you could support, for example, national level, poetry organizations, which, some of which I will also make sure to include links in the description box if you want to check those out. So those organizations that are doing the work to promote poetic um, language engagement across the board. Or also you could support, artists, right? Individual artists who are, utilizing poetic language and the poetic spirit as well. You could support them by, buying their work or sharing their work. And that is also a way to, help support this kind of effort. And then third suggestion that I have is to try chanting Nam-myoho Renge Kyo as a daily practice. And the reason why I mentioned that is because chanting helps us to do the internal work part, right? And so, it is a method through which we can address and overcome the fundamental or deep-rooted ignorance within our own lives, right? And so doing the internal work, is vital for, kind of two main reasons that I'll mention. One is to, again, so that we can recognize and transform the ways in which our own deep-rooted ignorance operates, which we may, not want to admit or even, want to consider having, maybe because, maybe what we stand for is righteous, right? We are working for a righteous cause. We make a lot of efforts to further that cause. So we may believe or feel that, we are exempt from ever experiencing something like that, like a deep-rooted or fundamental ignorance that's sort of like clouding our vision sometimes. But we're not, we're not exempt because we're all human, right? So me too, I have moments where I experience it, and so yeah, that's where that's where having a tool that's applied on a daily basis really helps, because I am a human and I'm not exempt from experiencing, moments where my inner, that enlightened self, the greater self, gets clouded or, covered up. And so yeah, it's helpful in helping us kind of stay on top of that, right? And then so the second reason why I'm mentioning how chanting helps in terms of doing the internal work is because It can help us to continually bring forth enlightenment, or in other words, the infinite courage, wisdom, and compassion that's necessary to create the kind of world that we want. And, creating the kind of world we want is hard work. Obviously, it can be exhausting and even sometimes demoralizing, right? Especially when things aren't going the way that we want it to go, and so that's why it's really helpful, for us to, in addition to fighting the necessary external battles, why it's helpful to also, continually refresh our spirit from within, right? And so, because ultimately, you know, what ignorance means is to forget about this universal truth that exists at the core of our own life, and that we can access at any given moment. So, I hope this video was helpful. And if so, please make sure to like and share, and subscribe to my channel. I plan on making more videos on different topics, kind of share the poetic perspective approach. And like I said, I will make sure to leave links in the description to the resources that I mentioned. And I will also create a Discord chat, as I believe it's called, as I'm, entering, uh, this century. And yeah, but I just wanted to have a place where we can stay in touch and encourage each other, share information for those who are interested. And so, yeah, feel free to reach out if you would like. And otherwise, I hope to see you again sometime. Bye.